Well, good afternoon or good morning, folks, depending on where you're located in the country. I'm BK, Director of the Park Maintenance Institute, and thank you for joining us for another Shop Talk. There is a need to educate athletic turf managers and field owners about important considerations and comparative research surrounding natural and artificial playing surfaces. The natural versus artificial discussion continues in this Shop Talk, highlighting considerations to decide whether or not you may want to add synthetic field into your athletic system. Our panelists today will discuss essential maintenance for synthetic surfaces, compare research on surface hardness, and even talk about why major sports teams in the NFL and Major League Baseball have chosen synthetic surfaces on their playing surfaces. So the objectives for this session are to become more aware of synthetic field maintenance requirements, to learn the whys and the whys nots of synthetic surfaces, and to learn about important considerations before choosing to install synthetic fields at your facilities. So now I would like to introduce Jeff Fowler, who is a senior extension educator at Penn State University Extension and an advisory board member for the Park Maintenance Institute. He's presented for us several times, and Jeff has brought together a panel of some of his colleagues to help expand this discussion and maybe highlight some of their insights onto synthetic turf. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
What's it called again? It's called.
Thank you, BK. I will first start by saying thank you very much for having me back to the Park Maintenance Institute Shop Talk. I think this is the third or fourth time that I've been a part of this lunchtime conversation. I believe it all started back when the whole pandemic thing started, and BK and the advisory committee were talking about how we could continue to communicate with members and other people around the country about important issues to park managers. Quite honestly, I could not talk about playgrounds and bark mulch or rubber mulch underneath the playgrounds for more than about 5 seconds and know anything about any of it. So, but I could talk about sports turf for more time than BK has allowed us. And we've done that on a number of occasions. But instead of me talking about synthetic versus natural turf on athletic fields, I decided to bring together two of my colleagues, two of my friends, or at least they were friends when we started. We'll have to wait and see how it all unfolds. And two, what I will go as far as to say, two experts when it comes to synthetic and natural surfaces. I have with me today Dr. Andy McNitt. Andy is a professor at Penn State University. He is in charge of the 4-year turf program for students. He is also the director of the Sports Research Center for Greater something. It's a whole lot of acronyms to say it's our sports turf research facility. Andy is the director of that. So Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
And at that center, Dr. McNitt does, with his colleagues, his research colleagues, does a considerable amount of research on synthetic turf, as well as he does on natural turf. So I thought he was an obvious fit to come to the group today. My other guest, as I'm looking at my screen, to Andy's right, Doug Shattenger. Doug is a friend, a colleague, a former STMA board member with me. He's a Cleveland Browns fan, so we're going to do our best to try to keep things clean for him. But Doug is president of Pioneer Athletics, mostly known or primarily known for their high quality paint for both synthetic and natural. And Doug is also, or has been, a member of the Synthetic Turf Council at the national level as well. So again, Doug being an expert, I asked him to come with me. Doug, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So this is a pretty broad topic, and one that has it has varying opinions and varying outlooks and different ways to look at synthetic versus natural. So I thought the first thing we could do is maybe have everybody turn their cameras on, if you would please, and give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down to some questions that I'm going to ask the group. Well, holy mackerel, the first one that flashes up is none other than the ultimate Boyd Montgomery. Boyd, we should put you on the panel as well. Anyway, if everybody could flip on their cameras, that way we can get some answers to some questions, because this is only an hour talk, and we could go on literally for 3 days about this topic if we needed to. So either Dan and eGastro and Veronica and some other folks either aren't listening or they don't have camera capabilities. So maybe we can do thumbs up, thumbs down for those that don't have camera capabilities. But
we can use the chat too.
Yeah, or throw it into the chat. Absolutely. So the first question is, how many of you have a synthetic surface in your park system that are here to learn about maintaining a synthetic surface? Yes or no? Thumbs up, thumbs down. How many of you are here? How many of you are here to potentially put synthetic in to your park system and wanted to learn more about synthetic versus natural in that system? Okay, so we got a couple of thumbs up there.
Yep, we had mainly no's on the first question and a couple of yeses on your second question.
Yep. Okay, so that'll help Andy and Doug as we go through the list of questions. And I will say, if you have specific questions for Andy, Doug, or myself, please feel free to turn your microphone on and yell at us and give us your question, or throw it into the chat pod. We're very informal in this presentation, so don't be afraid to just shout out the question, and we'll do our best to answer it. We would ensure then that we're answering the questions that you came here to make sure that you had, or the ones that you had, we're sure to answer. So I guess to get things started, the question that I get all the time, and I'm going to throw to our two panelists. I'm in a situation. Paul, good looking dog, by the way. It's never a Zoom. It's never a Zoom unless you get to see everybody's pets. But the question that I get asked all the time of me as a county-based educator doing sports turf work all across Pennsylvania and across much of the East Coast of the United States, which is best, synthetic or natural? What's the best surface for me to put in? I listen to salesmen, and salesmen tell me that if I put in a synthetic surface, I don't have to do any maintenance. And if I have a natural surface, I have to aerate, and I have to top dress, and I have to overseed, and I have to work on wear areas. But if I have a synthetic, I can just ignore it and play on it. So I guess, Doug, could you give me a little bit of flavor, and then I'll turn it to Andy as well on that thought process.
I think the question has stunned Doug.
That's as still as I have ever seen Doug.
Looks like he turned to stone.
All right, let's flip that around. Andy, why don't you go first? And then when you're done, he didn't like the question at all, so he just decided to leave.
He decided to leave. He decided to just leave it up to the rest of us.
Right.
Oh, wow. So there is no better surface, and which one you should select, it's a complicated situation. Oh, Doug's back. Go ahead, Doug. Did you get the question, or did you not even get that question? Oh, you were out. You're muted still. I'll go ahead.
1 second. Sorry.
So which one is better is, there's pros and cons to both. And I have, worked with high schools where I suggested that they not put in synthetic. And I've worked with some high schools where I suggested they did. My take on this, it's not a religion to me like it is to some people as to whether you're a natural or synthetic person. I mean, I've spent my whole life studying plants and studying grass and, the soils that grass grow in. So I'm a natural grass guy. And I think for most situations in most high schools and probably most park and rec, although it's, depending, there's a large diversity in park and rec, natural grass is probably the way to go. I think that oftentimes they're not managed correctly. I don't buy into most of the things that the synthetic turf people sell as, there's no maintenance. It'll pay for itself in 3 years. Most of those things aren't true. And my experience is those aren't really the reasons that the administrators are choosing synthetic turf, right? They're not really the reason. That it's sort of the reason that they might give the general public. It's great talking points to sort of tamp down the resistance to spending that money on synthetic. But what I find is that, if you're an athletic director, you have a lot to do. And I feel for athletic directors. When I look at their scheduling, it used to be when I played football back in the 1800s, they had, varsity football, JV football, and junior high football on that main stadium field. And there were no other events. 7th and 8th grade football played on a practice field somewhere at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was no soccer being played in the fall. But now, now you have 7th grade, 8th grade, you've got boys soccer, girls soccer, JV, all wanting to play on that field under the lights, at 7 p.m. at night so that the boosters can sell some hot dogs to the parents and, raise some money. And it's difficult. You have a rain game. Now you have to figure out when that field is open and you have an open schedule for that particular team and the away team. So scheduling becomes a nightmare. And so, having a rain out game creates real serious problems. And so the athletic director kind of likes that synthetic turf because they don't have to think as much about it, right? And there probably are going to be fewer rain out games. Now that doesn't mean it's the right pick, but I think sometimes that's one of the main drivers in the decision is, hey, we can just put play out there and not think about it. And so a lot of times that's part of the reasoning. So there isn't a better, we can talk about injuries at some point and discuss that. We can talk about costs, both are issues. But I think I'll leave it at that for right now and see if we get any feedback. And I'll let Doug talk about it.
Sorry, Evan.
All right. So if anybody has a follow-up question they want me to focus in on, any of those topics I brought up or any others, let me know. I mean, one of the things on cost is, what are you going to pay? $700,000 for this field? And I know costs have come down and it all has to do with the base construction tends to drive a lot of the costs. So we'll see them as low as, 500,000 and maybe as high as $1 million. But you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but you're falling into that till everything's said and done, a $700,000 cost. There is maintenance, and proper maintenance takes almost the amount of man hours that natural does. Not quite. It depends whether you decide to maintain it or not. And then secondarily, though, the material costs are considerably lower. You do need equipment. You don't need quite as much equipment. You do need some materials, not nearly as many. So, there is some maintenance costs, but, the question I have, if I take $700,000 and the school system or the park has to float a bond for that. You have to pay interest on that. You're looking at a replacement in 10 years and another replacement 10 years later. The base can usually stay in place, so your replacement costs are going to be more like, you know, $200,000 to dispose of the existing carpet and infill. They're trying to recycle that now, but you know, and another $200,000. So your replacement cost is going to be anywhere from $350 to $450, $425. You extend that out 20 years, you know, and you float the bond, and you're looking at like $86,000 per year, each year, you know, over the first 19 to 20 years. So my question is, you know, I know that they come from different pots of money. One's capital and one's maintenance. You know, are you spending $86,000 a year on that natural turf now? And usually the answer is no. And I understand that, you know, hiring people is a difficult process, but a lot of times that's what's lacking is labor. And people look at it as one, a scheduling issue, and two, a labor issue. And again, I think the man hours are comparable, but the decision-making on the maintenance takes a lower level of knowledge because you're not dealing with a living system. So I don't know if that was an academic answer or not. We can dive deeper into any one of those issues if anybody wants to talk about that.
Doug, let's try that again. You look like you have moved outside. You have the cool breeze blowing through your hair. That lake effect breeze from off of the lake in downtown beautiful Cleveland, I'm sure. Anyway, the original question was, which one do you think is best, natural or synthetic? And I know best is loaded. The word best is loaded.
Absolutely. So my thoughts are, if you need to play on the field 24 hours a day, you have limited space, and you're just trying to get as much use out of a field as possible, you really need to go synthetic. And we have a lot of people going synthetic more for image and recruiting rather than need. But grass will handle most needs in my region. And that would be cheaper, better, safer in many cases, most cases. So unless you're trying to meet, you know, the TV is going to turn on at 1 o'clock and you need the field to be ready no matter what, or you're trying to get enormous amounts of play, grass is generally the better choice.
Yeah, so Doug, one of the conversations that you and I had earlier this morning was we're talking about the demands on the fields, right? We seem to be wanting to put more and more and more events onto a surface with different lines, right? Different inbound, out of bound, whatever you want to call them, lines, whether they're hash marks, numbers, you know, high school soccer versus collegiate soccer, you know, those kinds of things. So maybe you want to further your conversation and talk about that.
Well, you on the highest end and big stadiums around the country, you have increasing number of events, and there's an NFL team that switched to synthetic recently because trying to convert from soccer to football and have, you know, in 24 hours is tough to do on grass because you can't remove lines. So, you know, there's an NFL facility next week that is playing women's national soccer on Thursday and their home opener on Sunday for football. And just removing lines and relining a field in grass is really tough to do. You can do it in LA, you can do it where you control water. You can't really do it in Cleveland or most of the Great Lakes states. If you are, you know, if you're going synthetic and you are using paint as a strategy, you really want to focus on inlaying lines that you need the most when the weather's the worst, because they're all water-based paints and you don't want to be lining in December, January, February, March, if you can help it in this climate. So just water-based systems, it's tough.
So Doug, my rule of thumb though is, I mean, you don't want these things looking like a Chinese checkerboard, right? I mean, Correct. It seems like the players can figure out which lines they're on without too much trouble. But on inlays, every time you put an inlay into synthetic turf, you kind of weaken the turf a little bit because you're going to have to cut the backing. And so my rule of thumb, and you correct me if you have a different thought, is probably no more than 2 different field configurations inlaid. And then if you have to do other ones, you paint the lesser ones. And I know you like to sell paint, so that's a good thing. But I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Otherwise, you're really cutting the turf too much and it begins to look ridiculous with the number of lines.
Yeah. So Doug, the whole paint thing, to kind of carry that thought of Andy's, is the whole paint industry has changed. And on these synthetic surfaces, right? I mean, there are now scrubbers that, make it really easy and really quick and easy to get rid of lines from this afternoon's game before tonight's game.
Well, I think that time frame is not doable from this afternoon to tonight, but you can turn a field from soccer to football in 6 hours. You can turn a field from football to soccer probably in 24 hours, just because there's so many more lines to remove. The main removing equipment is around $42,000, so it's not cheap, and not everyone can afford it. But the technology is developed quickly, and we have created systems with customers that you're going from literally MLS soccer to NFL football in 24 hours.
They do a couple of other things though, Doug, right? You have a drying issue. So after you scrub the paint, it has to dry before you put the new paint on. So, I mean, they'll come out with blowers and try to blow those dry. I mean, and that ends up being and you tell me, because you know better than I do, but changing from football to soccer, if you only have one scrubber, it's going to take a while, right?
It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can remove, end zone in maybe 45 minutes if you know what you're doing. But football, you've got a mile of lines that you need to remove. And all those hash marks and everything else it's a time consuming process with just one machine. So if you're doing this, it's going to be, Carolina Panthers bought 6 of them. Atlanta has 5 of them. So it's not cheap or easy. And going back to Andy, your point about 2 fields, I think absolutely more than 2 is crazy, but you can inlay tick marks to help you lay out the field quickly and easily when you do need to. So off the field surface, just choose a different color green. And I'd worry about inlaying soccer, penalty kicks, corner kicks, lacrosse creases, just because inlays just get brutalized in those areas.
Good point.
So we've had a little discussion then about comparing the synthetic to the natural surface. We've talked about the advantages of a synthetic. We've talked about the advantages of a natural. I'm going to get a little bit more specific since we don't have any questions popping up. And I'm, Doug, not to avoid you, but I'm going to throw this at Andy because I know a lot of his research is around this, and that is injuries on the 2 surfaces. Which would the athlete, which ones, I won't say safer or more dangerous, because that's not a safe way, or that's not a good way to put it. But let's talk about injuries for a while, Andy. You can run with that.
So with a helmeted player and concussions, we're seeing no difference in the NFL, whether it's synthetic or natural. And it's explained to me this way by the biomechanics experts. The deal is you have 2 springs pushing against one another, and the spring that's going to give is the weakest one. Doesn't matter about this spring, right? As long as it's stronger than this one, it doesn't matter how strong it is or how weak it is. The weaker one's going to give. And the weaker one by design is the helmet. And so while it's not proving out statistically, there's no difference. And they have to collect an awful lot of data, right, on each system. And there really aren't as many data points as you'd think to make it statistically significant. But the epidemiological people tell me that maybe even a softer synthetic field or a softer field period will give you more concussions on a helmeted player. And the reason for that is a major component of concussion is rotation, either as the helmet hits or right before. And you can kind of think that if you fall face first, that face mask is going to engage with a softer surface and result in more rotation. They're telling me they actually believe there would be less concussions if you played football on ice as compared to either of the synthetic or natural surfaces, because there's less engagement with the helmet. So let's move concussions away, and now let's look at lower extremity injuries. We're looking at lower extremity injuries in the NFL. We have aggregated 16% more lower extremity injuries on synthetic than natural. And you can pick that data apart, and you can get some non-contact knee injuries up to 32%. Other ones fall down to 6 or 7%, but aggregated together, it's running about 16% more injuries on synthetic than natural. Once again, a softer surface is not necessarily better because they're worried about cleat engagement. If that cleat sinks, it engages more and thus it sticks more. While those, again, it takes a lot of data to tease that out. So when we look at lower extremity injuries, the big issue is, natural turf will divot and synthetic turf doesn't. And that divoting is a natural limit to what kind of stress is being put on the athlete, right? So if we got synthetic turf to divot, we would be better off. Now, the turf is important and the surface is important, but when we look at the surfaces and we look at the shoes, the surfaces have this much difference in them from natural to synthetic, and the shoes have a much greater difference. So the first thing you should do if you're worried about lower extremity injuries is make sure the athletes are in the right shoes. Shoes don't matter as much on natural grass because of the natural give, the divoting that occurs. But on synthetic, the shoes matter a lot. We have a shoe database that you can find on our website at ssrc.psu.edu. Again, that stands for Sports Surface Research Center, ssrc.psu.edu. And we even have the posters that are put up in NFL locker rooms encouraging people to stay away from certain dangerous cleats. So that's number one. Number two, then, if you maintain the field, our belief is, and we have a data that indicates this, but isn't statistically significant, again, because we're still collecting. You need a lot of data. And there's only, 30 fields in the NFL. That if you maintain it by keeping that infill up, you've got a little less reveal, which is the amount of fiber that sticks above the infill. And with greater infill depth, we're getting slightly better cleat release. It's not huge, but slightly better cleat release. So keeping the infill filled certainly helps. But the big thing is make sure you have the right shoes. Even after you do all of that, you're still going to have more lower extremity injuries likely. Now, when we're looking at NFL players, that doesn't necessarily translate to high school or youth athletes. But, the NCAA has data out that is sort of mirroring the NFL data, and there is data being collected on high schools and so forth. So the trend looks to be pretty consistent. I can keep talking, Jeff, or you can.
No, I was looking for the unmute button.
All right.
So yeah, I think that it's interesting the injuries. We do a coworker and I we do a weekly podcast, and last week we had Tony Leonard from the Philadelphia Eagles on, and we were talking about this very issue of synthetic versus natural. And Tony's comment was pretty interesting to me, and I guess I hadn't really taken much time to think about it, but he's like, a lot of these young athletes coming up through into the NFL, draft and into the combine, they've never played on natural grass. They played on a high school field at a higher caliber high school that had a synthetic field. They were recruited to a college that had a synthetic field, and they get to a collegiate level where, a lot of time, or to an NFL level, and a lot of times they have to play on a natural surface, and it's different for them. So his comment was interesting, because we had the same conversation about injuries, and he said, if you ask the athletes, all the older ones would say, I'd much rather play on natural grass. It was easier on their bodies. At least that's what they felt. But it was just interesting that his answer was really quick, as the old guys all want to do this. And I was thinking to myself, do I fit into that older guy category? And yeah, you're right. I do. Andy, you
Yeah,
so the good news is if I fit in, I know you do too.
Thanks.
Um,
They all practice on natural grass, at every level. So they're not all practicing on synthetic. It's not like they've never been on natural grass.
no, right. But playing games on, synthetic fields.
Yeah.
Doug, you were going to say something.
You also on synthetic need to be have a specific plan for heat, because synthetic turf fields are 40 to 50 degrees hotter under direct sun in the summer than grass, and so you do need to have a plan for when's too hot, and a different approach than on grass.
Right. And so we can talk about heat a little bit. There's all kinds of marketing things out there. There's Cool Play. There's all these different ones. Our research shows that you're going to get about 10 degrees out of the best ones. That's about it. So in my mind, there is no cost efficient way to cool synthetic turf. I mean, there are systems where you could create, massive amount of air conditioning and blow it up through the drainage system. But we've tried all kinds of things, tarping, watering. I mean, watering keeps the field cool for about 20 minutes because there's no real heat sink there. What happens is almost all of the heat is reflected. So there's a couple of things you need to know about heat on synthetic turf. They are crazy hot on clear sunny days, right? And that's because and it's not really the crumb rubber. Everybody thinks the crumb rubber is what's making it hot. And it's not really. The crumb rubber acts like an insulator, and it doesn't allow any heat to go down, right? And it's really the fibers. The old traditional AstroTurf is actually hotter than the synthetic systems because there were more fibers and there wasn't infill. So all the heat's reflected. But the air temperature, when we talk about 40 to 50, I mean, we've measured temperatures here like 175 degrees without really trying to look for the hottest potential day. So it gets hot. That's central Pennsylvania. But that heat is the surface, right? The heat at waist height above that surface is 10 to 20, sometimes 30 degrees warmer, but usually more like 10, 15 degrees. You can find that heat. But the heat at the surface is so hot that there's research that shows it does go into the foot, and that heat has to be relieved by the body. So there is a heat strain there. But it can get so hot that it will burn you if you touch it. It's like blacktop, right? You can walk on blacktop with shoes. Yeah, it's warmer, but it's not crazy warm. But boy, you put your hand on there and you can burn your hand just like you can on sand at the beach, right? As soon as the sun goes down, they cool off. They'll cool off more rapidly than natural grass because they don't have a heat sink. And so they warm up real fast, and we see a cumulus cloud go over, and in a matter of like 30 seconds, they'll cool off 15, 20, 30 degrees because they're not holding any heat. But Doug is right. This is an issue. And so when it's bright and clear days, when those hot, humid days, it's not quite as bad because it tends to be hazy. And so you don't get that direct sunlight. A question I often get is, does it add to the heat sink in a city? And the answer is no. It really doesn't. They will cool off so rapidly. They're not really holding any heat. So it is an issue. Watering doesn't work. Tarping doesn't work. Different colored infills doesn't work. The different systems that all the various manufacturers are touting as cooling, they do cool, but if you get much over 10 degrees cooling out of them, you're going to be really lucky. So yeah, heat is an issue.
Yeah, so I'm going to take just a quick break here and ask the audience if you have any questions for either Dr. McNitt or Doug Shattenger, our guests here today on the panel. You can throw them into the chat pod, or you can unmute yourself and feel free to ask those directly to us. We want to make sure you get your questions answered here today.
I know one thing that comes to mind for me is when we're thinking about longevity of, the playing surfaces. Is there a certain calculation that people can kind of think like, well, if it's a synthetic, I can play year round, so therefore I can continuously make money and keep my seasons going. Because I mean, when I think of high schools, the seasons are getting longer and longer in the sense of we're starting earlier and earlier in the spring and it's extending as far as we can into the fall. And so is that something people should be taking as a decision factor as well? Or are we looking for a mix? And like I was over at the Episcopal Academy over outside the Westchester area in Pennsylvania, and they had a couple of synthetic fields just for that purpose. So they could have year-round practice and start things earlier, but then they mainly had natural surfacing and turf because that's kind of the preference there. So what are some thoughts on that?
You want
Making
to
those
start on that, Doug?
decisions.
If you want me to start on that.
Well, I mean, I'll start a little bit and you finish. I mean, one of the advantages of synthetic turf is it does get hot. So in the winter, it melts the snow much more quickly, and teams get out and start practicing on synthetic way before they're able to get out on grass. So we'll extend your season earlier in the spring. But a lot of people do use synthetic turf fields to take the brunt of the wear, which in long term will improve the health and playability of the grass fields. So using them in combination is a good choice for some, but it does allow you to extend the season into the winter.
Yeah, and you need to be careful. But the Big Ten, the majority of the baseball fields in the Big Ten are synthetic, not Penn State, but many of the others. And the reason is the coaches want to get out there in February, and even to attract a coach, they're using the synthetic to attract them to the Big Ten, saying, "Hey, we'll put synthetic in for you so you can get out there in February." Of course, then what we actually find in reality is, they want them to plow snow. We can talk about how to plow snow and the problems with plowing snow. And then, okay, the field looks okay and you can play on it, but the wind chill's minus 20, right? That's not baseball weather. And so they stay inside anyway. But, on any particular Thursday that it might get to 45 degrees and the wind's not blowing, they might be out there. But you're right. Early, and let's face it, early in the season, if you have a native soil field, it's going to take a long time for that to dry out. Now it's wet and it's okay to play on, but they're going to do a lot of damage on that field, and then that it doesn't want to recover. But you can kind of extend some seasons, but I think sometimes, especially in the spring, that's oversold a little bit.
I find some of the lacrosse players want to get out there early. So as soon as they see synthetic turf blade, they're on it and want someone to paint it. Other sports, not so much.
The best thing you can do if you're maintaining synthetic turf is tell them that you can't plow, because once you plow it once, they're going to want it plowed all the time. And you need to be really careful when you plow these things. I mean, you need a rubber tipped blade, or at least take a piece of PVC pipe and split it and pound it on the bottom of the blade. Who's ever plowing can't be a cowboy. They got to go real slow, real easy. The best way to get it off is never let it get above about 4 inches. You let it get to a foot, now you're really fighting a tough battle. So if you plow it as the snow is coming down, that's good. Also, don't think that you need to get all the snow off. Again, the light will interact with that surface and heat it up. So you only need to get it down to about 1/4 of an inch. And if you want to spread a little bit of crumb rubber on it, that's a good melting agent. And also, if you broom it while it's sort of melting, you run a broom over it, that will speed the melting process up to some degree.
Did you have a question there, Enrique?
Yeah, I did. I don't have to worry about the snow or anything like that in South Florida, so forgive me. Question is, we have currently natural fields, and sometimes, we, based on the amount of usage that we are getting, and it's only growing with the local travel teams and things like that, our fields can go down for, a month or 2 months for resodding, something like that. More so, obviously, I know with turf, that is kind of going to go away. But if there was to be scheduled maintenance on what type of timeline would we expect when it comes to that? So I get, obviously, there will be some sort of maintenance, but we do have a crew that tend to the fields daily. But ultimately, as far as if we were to having to close those fields, is there a timetable as far as closures?
Closures of synthetic, you're asking?
Yes, sir.
I mean, first of all, on the sod issue, if you're having to close it for, what did you say, a month or 2 months to resod?
Yeah, it's not all our fields, but like I said, we do have, obviously in the winter here is, it's not much different than everyone else's, but obviously the winter is definitely drier here. It's a lot cooler, and then so the grass obviously doesn't grow, therefore it starts wearing down. So basically, springtime, we typically would do like either a aerate or a resod. And then, we kind of get through it all through summer. You got, all the weather issues and stuff like that. But
I don't know how much
fall when we start seeing it.
I don't know how much revenue you lose in 2 months, but I mean, if you want to spend a lot of money, you can buy thick cut Bermuda sod that's already been overseeded with rye for your winter play, and you can lay and play on it within a day or two.
Right.
And so that's an option, but it's an expensive option, right?
Yeah.
On the synthetic side, I mean, the main maintenance that you're going to do, the big maintenance on the year, is going to be replacing that infill. Occasionally, you got to do a deep cleaning. Fine, once a year, once every other year, they're fine. I don't think they're as needed as people seem to think that they're needed. But I think replacing infill, and you really, depending on how much that's played on, you don't need to replace that infill maybe even every year, like a broadcast across the whole field. But there'll be spot treatments that are needed that you should really be checking between events. So you check the goal mouth of soccer, you check the goal mouth of lacrosse, or very high wear areas, and you'll check it for infill depth. Doug will show you an infill depth gauge here in a second. And you can go out and spot treat those with guys with 5-gallon buckets and brooms, right? And so, I mean, it can be done in a couple of hours. So you're not talking about shutting that field down for long periods of time, other than if you're going to do a deep cleaning, a couple of days. If you're going to do a complete top dressing over the whole field, a day or two of shutdown, but that's probably it. Oh, Doug's walking back in to get the gauge. I didn't know you had to do that. I could bring a picture. I can come up with a picture. But you want to get an infill depth gauge if you have a synthetic turf field, and they're inexpensive. I mean, there are some out there that are a couple $100, but you get one for about $15 on Amazon, $30 on turftech.com. You're down in Florida, so you can talk to John Mascaro down there. Maybe you know him. And we have a spreadsheet on our website that you can download. It will give you suggestions on where all to test around the field, and then it'll kind of run some numbers for you and let you know whether it's even enough or where the low spots are. And you get a pretty good sense of it after you do it a few times. And really daily, or after events, a little bit of hand maintenance and you're out. Once a year, maybe you need to shut it down for a couple of days.
Okay. And what you said, a 10-year, kind of like a 10-year resurfacing, is that just if it can live beyond their 10 years, can that be done, or is it a recommendation at 10 years to redo?
Yeah, so the question is, how long do they last? I mean, that has to do with a lot of things. If they're indoors, they're going to last a lot longer because UV light's not an issue. So they do break down from UV light. There again, the deeper you keep the infill, the less reveal there is, the less that it's getting exposed to UV light. So then it has to do with, your particular microclimate. Realize that the warranties are only good for 8 years. So it's going to be out of warranty after 8. What we find is the main reason they're replaced is aesthetics. They don't look good anymore. They look really ratty. But from a physical playability standpoint, what happens is eventually so much of the fiber is worn down that you can't get enough infill into it any longer, right? The fiber wears down and you can't refill it to the level that it should be filled to make it a safe playable field. And then from a playability standpoint, it needs to be removed. My experience is most of the time it's removed prior to that for aesthetics. Now, here's one of the reasons that we hear about hard fields, right? Is that you get a high school, you get a park, whatever the situation is, and they should be refilling that infill, right? But they've been told it's no maintenance, and so they don't know anything about that. So the fibers are wearing down, but at the same time, the infill's walking away, right? And they're both wearing down, and pretty soon you're playing on no cushioning because the fiber's worn down, the infill's disappearing, walk off crumb rubber, it just goes off with the players and their shoes and on their equipment. And if you never replenish that, I guess you don't notice that the infill's walking away. Those fields become dangerous to play on. And I've seen many of them because nobody's ever taken care of them. So how long do they last? I think 10 years is pushing it, especially if you're using it all the time and it's outdoors. I mean, I would start to think about an 8, maybe pressing it to 9-year turnaround window. And if you get 10 out of it, consider yourself lucky. But they're only warranted for 8.
I think in Florida, it's also going to be pushing it longer if you're hoping for longer than 8 or 9 years, because UV is the biggest killer of synthetic turf fields, UV and foot traffic. And to Andy's point, if you keep the infill levels too low, the fibers will start bending over, and then you get a lot of fiber exposed to UV, not just the very tips. And that and the foot traffic will really kill synthetic turf faster than anything else.
Well, and that last comment kind of answered the question for me, but I was going to raise the question in a sense of municipalities and organizations that are a more multi-use kind of thing. And in that sense, it can concerts be held on, natural fields? We know we can do things by just laying down some plywood or something. So is there similar mitigations that we need for a synthetic turf, or is it something that like we shouldn't have that kind of foot traffic on a synthetic field because it would ruin it?
There's lots of events you can have. If you have the appropriate decking, you can have huge concerts with, tens of thousands of people. They do it all the time. The issue is you need a plan for when the decking comes up. And that's when you need the deep tines, the really intense grooming of the field. You have to have a magnet, because after any concert or any big event like that, you're going to pull up all kinds of metal. We've been at facilities where we're pulling up, probably 15-gallon Ziploc bags full of screws. And, you walk the field, you don't see it. You pull a magnet, you find it. So if you have big events, just plan for extra intense grooming. You're going to need a groomer, sweeper, depending on how much weight is on it. Something like a deep tiner, break things up.
You do have to protect the field if you're bringing in cranes, or, you need to even be careful with the traditional forklift, because what you don't want to do is mess up that base. And so if you end up indenting the base at all, it's going to be a real problem to fix. So you can't just run anything out there. I still like to see, you control down pressure, or you lay out plywood or decking to get, some of this equipment on and off the field. You shouldn't think that the synthetic is just, well, we can roll anything out there. But on the other hand, yeah, you can hold events on it, but you still need to keep them protected.
Yeah, someone on our test field ran a crane to change a light fixture, and we had ruts, so we ripped it out and replaced it. So they're unfixable until you rip it out and level the base.
So you need to protect the field.
Do we have any other questions from other participants? I'm looking at the screen here. You can shout them out, take your microphone off of mute and throw them out to us.
If not, I'll talk about a couple of things that I usually, these are big questions that I get. So, hey, I don't have any synthetic turf at my facility, but they're thinking about putting one in. What type of fiber should I go with? Slit film or monofilament? So, some of the data suggests the monofilaments will last longer due to wear than slit film. But I will tell you, from a maintenance standpoint, if you're really going to be beating this field a lot, I really like slit film. And the reason is that, yeah, the fibers will bend over a little easier than monofilament, but they'll also stand back up faster. And so I think if you have a lot of play on these fields, I think slit film is the way to go. Monofilament is touted for ball roll and soccer because the fibers tend to stand up a little bit better. And that might be true, but it takes an awful lot of grooming to get any maintenance out of it or to get any difference in playability out of it. And so I really think you're better off with slip film. The next question that I get is, do I need a pad under it? And I will tell you, out of all the NFL fields, which everything keeps changing, so now we're up to 12 in the NFL. 6 of them have pads and 6 of them do not. And the question that I usually come back to you with is, are you going to maintain that field? Right? If you maintain that field and you keep the infill levels where they're supposed to be, and you replace the field when it needs to be replaced because you can't keep the infill levels where they should be, you don't need a pad. But if you're not sure how good your maintenance is going to be, the pad is a nice insurance policy, because as that infill disappears, at least you have something there giving you cushioning. I prefer, the first one, right? I would prefer you take care of that field. You're going to get more longevity out of it. In that case, you can save yourself $60,000 to $70,000 by not putting a pad in. But if you're not going to take care of the field, it's an insurance policy. The favorite pad is a port in place E-layer for me. If you do it right, you should be able to get at least 2 resurfacings out of that same pad. You'll have to patch it a little bit, but you should be able to resurface at least one more time besides that install. I think that's it. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Doug.
A couple of things. If you're going to put in synthetic turf, I recommend getting an expert that has a lot of experience with synthetic turf. I had a project here locally that just was going to be brutal, and I sat down with them and made them hire a synthetic turf expert, and it saved massive problems. Turned a terrible field into a good field really quickly. Also, I would really, on the design stage, focus on drainage, because decent drainage today means that you have lousy drainage in 8 years. You want great drainage on day one, so you have good drainage when your field ends its life. And also, as your field ages, I sort of view synthetic turf fields as like the new car syndrome. When you get it, people are very particular about how often it's groomed, how well it's taken care of. You're washing and polishing it every day, parking it far away from everything else, taking care of it. 6 years from now, you're driving it off the cliff and ignoring it and letting it fail. So that's where a pad, if you're going to follow that path, then a pad is going to be super important year 6, 7, 8. But if you can commit to the life of the field, taking care of it, I agree with Andy 100%. Any other questions?
I was talking to myself. And Andy, do you have any other like calls that you get with common questions that when people are making this decision, natural versus synthetic? I know you get a lot of those calls. You help with a lot of design. You help with a lot of I'd say construction, but I've never seen you lay carpet. But you get a lot of those. What are the other common questions you get?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is when you're trying to permit these fields, is it a pervious or impervious surface? And it's very municipality dependent as to what you can get away with. But if the drainage system's designed correctly, I believe it's a pervious surface. And it might be more pervious than a native soil field. I mean, what's your native soil field perking at right now? 1/4 of an inch if you're lucky, once it's compacted. And so you can save a lot on permitting if you can convince the municipality that it is a pervious surface. Now, to do that, you're probably going to have to spend a little bit of extra money on drainage. And so what we've been successful doing in some situations is you put in deeper stone, and then you move the pipes from the bottom of the stone to the top of the stone, right? Now, when water percolates into that system, it lays there in that gravel, and a lot of it can recharge the groundwater. And if you have a huge storm where that all fills up, it's going to hit the pipes and go into the storm sewer system. But as compared to, a lot of native soil fields that are 1/4 of an inch, some municipalities will buy that. And again, you need an expert, as Doug suggested, to help sell that to them. And some will not, regardless of, whether it makes sense or not. So that's one question I get. The other question I often get is, why do synthetic turf surfaces get hard? And everybody seems to think that it's because of compaction, and it's not. I wish it was compaction because we know how to decompact things, right? I mean, that crumb rubber should be, I mean, assuming you're getting a quality install and you can check what, you get this tested, you can quality control test the infill as it goes in, but it's all the same size. So it's sort of like those ball pits at McDonald's, right? Which is, I think, where COVID started. I'm not sure. But in those ball pits at McDonald's, right, they don't compact. And the infill doesn't compact either. There's two reasons why synthetic turf gets hard. One is walk-off crumb rubber. That's your cushion, and it's almost imperceivable. That crumb rubber slowly leaves the field and your mat is getting thinner and thinner. And the second reason is paint buildup, right? If you just keep painting over the same area over and over again and you never remove that paint, those areas are going to get really, really hard. When we instituted hardness standards in the NFL, there was one stadium in particular where the paint had to be chiseled out. I mean, it was in there so solid that it needed to be chiseled out of synthetic turf. So those are a couple of questions that come to mind as to.
Andy, how about bacteria? Bacterial infections or bacteria being held in a synthetic surface.
Right. So prior to COVID, the NFL sort of banned the use of any antimicrobials. Now, they would still let you use detergent to clean the surface, which detergent, in my research, has turned out to be a great antimicrobial. But an even better one? Sunlight. So you take these surfaces outside and sunlight will kill bacteria and, turns out, viruses pretty well. COVID came along, everybody panicked in the early stages. They didn't realize that, it was primarily spread through respiratory. And so air movement was very important. And so what they did was they said, well, we'll let you go ahead and put some antimicrobials. We would prefer that you use detergent, so a dilute solution of Tide. And outdoor fields, they said, needed nothing. So indoor fields, they said a dilute solution of Tide and maybe the UV pull behind deals that we have. The one thing the doctors told us about UV was it doesn't leave any residuals. So it kills what's there, but there's no residual, where some of my research and some others have showed if you sprayed with liquid Tide, a dilute solution of that, it'll leave residuals. So most of you have outdoor fields. I think as soon as the sun comes up, I mean, we're seeing 99% of bacteria killed in 15 minutes. So indoor fields, maybe. It's really not a big issue.
Completely agree, Andy. I would tell people a couple of things. One, for painting synthetic, use a little paint as you can. I've had situations where people are standing behind me saying, I missed a spot. Go to the closest seat you can find and tell me if I missed a spot. But use 317 tip, no more than 1,000 PSI. Put down as light a coat as possible and don't paint the infill. The key is just paint the tips of the fibers. And as far as disinfecting go, the last place on earth you should spend money is disinfecting an outdoor synthetic turf field, because there's no food for the virus or bacteria. It's going to be hot. It's going to be drier than normal. And of all the places to disinfect, choose somewhere else first.
Agreed.
So I'll go back to the audience again. We're just about out of time, but I will ask if there are any last minute questions for our panelists. Hearing none, I would like to personally thank Dr. McNitt and Doug for joining us today on Shop Talk. And I will turn it back over to you, BK, to do whatever you have to do to wrap us up.
Jeff, can I make one comment before we break up?
Please do, Doug.
I've seen a lot of people choose synthetic over grass, solving a relatively minor problem on grass. So there's a lot of fields where the drainage was installed 50 years ago and the field is not draining well. And so they choose to install synthetic to solve underinvestment for 50 years on a grass field. And that happens repeatedly. And I think that those are the things that concern me. Are you choosing synthetic for the right reason? And because you have a drainage problem today on a system that you installed 50 years ago, fix the drainage problem and you have a great grass field. You don't necessarily install synthetic.
Yeah, I'll echo that, Doug, exactly. But it's not only poor drainage systems that were installed 50 years ago. It's often poor drainage systems that were installed 2 years ago because they weren't installed by a athletic field expert. Look, your architects at your local schools that you work with, you know, they understand HVAC, that's great. But when I see these specifications come out and it's like, here's how you put in a home lawn. That's fine. That's not how you put in a high use athletic field. And so you need to hire architects and designers or engineers who have experience with athletic turf. And if you know, I get it. The administrators don't know, right? They put in $250,000 worth of drainage and the field doesn't drain. So they throw up their hands and say, let's buy carpet. But if you've got to design the fields correctly. And unfortunately, a lot of local architects just don't have that experience. So they think it's easy and it's a little more complicated than that.
Happens
Good
all the
point,
time.
Doug.
Well, and it's a very, very interesting conversation for us to really kind of think of. There's so many different climates and so many different variables that each of our facilities will take into account. So is there an answer kind of across the board, whether it just be land grant schools or like, is there a resource that we can really look at that is a catch-all? Of course, aside from the Park Maintenance Institute, but I mean, as far as sports turf experts and things, are there certain organizations that folks can really tap into to get some of those special answers, or, you know, reaching out to their local extensions and things like that? What are some options for folks?
So I think the STMA, the Sports Turf Managers Association, is a great resource to reach out to, whether that's national or whether it's on the local, each state level. Most states now have a chapter or are affiliated with a chapter that would have local resources. Certainly your land grant universities, many of them have resources available as well. And other local resources that you would consider, I think, are people that have put in a synthetic, or people that have gone through the decision process of doing that, and, you know, how they went through it and what their decision, kind of their matrix was on making that decision.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff. And folks, as I did say, the Park Maintenance Institute is here to be a resource for you. So if you have more questions that we haven't had an answer to today, or if something happens to come up next week or even next year, please reach out to me directly and I will help you find the right answer, or at least connect you with the knowledge that you are seeking. So I want to say thank you to Jeff and Andy and Doug for taking the time to share your expertise and your experience for the past hour with us. I would like to thank everyone for participating today that was with us live. This session has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, so I will be sharing that link. And anyone that did go for the CEU credits, you will be receiving a survey link for that as well, post-event here. So thank you again. I'm BK, Director of the Park Maintenance Institute, and I look forward to hosting you all again in the future. Have a great day.
Thanks, BK.